Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for coming. We are starting our seminar with Professor Julia Tomei from University College London. Professor Marcelo Cunha is going to comment, also add some comments to her presentation. And now I'll take her to start the speaking. Thank you. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming this morning. And my sincere apologies for not speaking any Portuguese. So thank you for your patience. I'm Julia Tomei. I'm an associate professor at University College London. I work in an institute called the Institute for Sustainable Resources, which is an interdisciplinary institute that looks from kind of social, economic, and environmental perspectives at issues of resource use, climate change, circular economy, and so on. So I think there's probably a lot of parallels with the work that you all do. This is actually, I think, my 5th or 6th time in Brazil, only ever having been to Sao Paulo, so next time I will explore more of your beautiful country. Most of my work, I originally started working here because I have a background in biofuels, which I think lots of you also do. So thinking about land use change, so essentially thinking about how growing demand for a new commodity, a new product, shaped land use particularly in Latin America, but also in Africa. From there, I kind of moved a bit more into thinking about energy systems and energy transitions, and for a while I've been focusing on issues around electricity access and access to clean cooking, which is what I'm going to focus on today, because that's more of what I've been doing recently, and I don't want to present things that are now 8 or 10 years out of date. But I wanted to say a huge thanks to Aline and to Marcelo for welcoming today and for responding. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially what the challenge is when we're thinking about electricity access or energy access. I've done some work thinking about the issues with how we are defining and measuring access, why it matters, a word on demand, because I think this is key if we're going to address the issues around energy access, and then some thoughts on the future. So you will all be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, and SDG 7 in particular focuses on energy. The MDGs, which ran from 2000 to 2015, there was only 7 or 8 of them, I think, and energy was called the missing SDG. In 2015, we saw the Sustainable Development Goals with energy kind of placed at their core, and there's been various bits and pieces of work which shows just how fundamental energy is to underpinning sustainable development and the desires and the aspirations we have as humanity. So we have 3 targets and 2 mechanisms for getting there. So the first one is to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services. The second, to increase substantially the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. And the third on energy efficiency. And then the 2 kind of mechanisms for getting there are through international cooperation, infrastructure and finance. So where are we? Every year, what's known as the custodian agencies, so the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, Sustainable Energy for All, and a couple of others, produce a tracking framework which looks across those 5 indicators at how the world is doing to progress towards SDG 7. And what we see when we think about SDG 7.1, which is thinking about energy access, is that we're actually not doing too badly. So 7.1 is access to electricity, and you can see that the number of people without access to electricity has fallen significantly over the kind of 7 years or so that we've been tracking electricity access. Primary fuels, the second one is about clean cooking, which until I think around 5 or 6 years ago was very much a secondary concern for the international community, but something that we're seeing increasing kind of innovation and kind of efforts to try and tackle. So that we're looking at 2.7 billion people who lack access to clean cooking. So this is essentially a move away from solid fuels like dung, or kind of wood fuel towards fuels like electricity or liquid petroleum gas, and also the use of improved cook stoves. And that, you see, we are also making some progress, but the progress is much slower. So if we look at where in the world we're making progress and where we're not, you see that fundamentally this is a challenge for Sub-Saharan Africa. There are parts of Asia which also have challenges in terms of meeting access to electricity. And parts of Latin America also. I mean, Haiti is the one, Latin American, Caribbean. Haiti is typically the country that is doing least well in these targets. But you can see parts of Latin America also haven't achieved universal access to electricity. But really, this is an issue in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is where I think 60 or 70% of the population who lack access to electricity remain. And these little arrows, indicators, are the top 20 countries, those countries which have the highest electricity access deficit, so where most effort needs to be placed in future. And you can see most of them are in Sub-Saharan Africa and some in Asia. When we look at access to clean cooking, the picture is totally different. And actually it's quite surprising just how extensive the issue of access to clean cooking is. So again, it remains concentrated in Sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see that the majority of the continent has very low levels of access to clean fuels and technologies. So much of this is also a rural issue, so people in urban environments will have access to modern kind of fuels and technologies. But you can see that in other parts of the world that might surprise you, India, China, for example, there are issues around access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. And again, in Latin America, there are large parts of the population that continue to rely on traditional fuels. I'm not going to talk so much about clean cooking, but this is an area that I think is increasingly of interest to the international communities, and lots of innovation in terms of business models and financing to drive access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. One of the challenges is it's much more difficult to measure because it's measured at the household rather than perhaps at a community or through the installation of infrastructure. And it also means that there is challenges around capturing the benefits for those who are looking to kind of drive finance in the clean cooking sector. So really interesting, but not the focus of my talk. So focusing on electricity access, it looks like we're making progress, which is great, but we still have a long way to go, and it's looking unlikely that we'll meet the target by 2030 of universal access to electricity. So what do we know? Well, firstly, it's difficult to measure. Clean cooking is even harder, but access to electricity is difficult. There's no universal standard, and that means that there's no kind of minimum service level. There's no number of kilowatt hours that a household should be consuming in order to be considered to have access to electricity. One of the other challenges is that the way in which the targets are tracking progress against the SDG 7.1, both components, is that it's binary. You either have it or you don't. You're either using clean fuels and technologies or you're not. Primary reliance. And as a result, this really fails to capture the issues, the things, the complexities of access to electricity. So these numbers are not reflecting realities on the ground, essentially. And the other challenge, and this is perhaps shifting slightly, but there was a focus on grid connections. The preferred manner, and I think much of what's happened in Latin America, is that there has been expansion of the grid to deliver access, and much less of a focus on distributed systems, particularly in rural areas. And this focus masks other issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. So we were interested in understanding, well, what are we tracking? What are we measuring? if we're looking at has not access, what does this actually mean? We looked at the tracking framework for SDG 7, and we looked at the numbers that lay behind this, and we compared the two custodian agencies for SDG 7.1, so the World Bank and the International Energy Agency. And what we found is that the two agencies use very different types of data when they're tracking access to electricity. So the World Bank, for example, uses periodic surveys. It uses things like census data. It uses kind of large-scale national surveys, which it only does every kind of 5 to 10 years or so. And they tend to use binary questions. Do you have not access to electricity? The International Energy Agency, by comparison, is much more reliant or using its utilities data, essentially, and those from solar home system suppliers, those from mini-grids. And where they are lacking data, because inevitably they have an algorithm that basically predicts a kind of continued trend in terms of electricity access. And if you're interested in the paper, it was published in Nature Energy last year. So what did we find? You're not going to be able to read this graph, so my apologies. But what you see here, essentially, is this is for Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, and this is for 48 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'll talk about the blue lines here is the IEA data by country. So these are the tracking kind of real-time utility or mini-grid data. And this is the World Bank data that's using those kind of periodic surveys. And then this is essentially the difference in the numbers between the two. And what you see essentially is that some countries, they're very much aligned. So in Equatorial Guinea, we pretty much see alignment between the two ways of measuring electricity access. If we look, for example, at Namibia, you see, according to the IEA, access is essentially flatlined, whereas if you go by the World Bank, you see essentially a kind of a slow increase in electricity access. And when you look at the region as a whole, again, you see discrepancies. The dark blue, this line here, is the maximum electricity access. And this grey line is the kind of minimum that we see. And what it shows us essentially, the last data we had, last year we had data for was 2021. You see there's basically uncertainty about the electrification status of 87 million people, which is huge. And that's around 45% of the total reported progress. So really interesting as far as I'm concerned. And why does this matter? Well, obviously, if you're looking at the data, it affects the policy decisions, the planning, the electrification targets that you're setting yourself. And if we take Togo, for example, you see, according to the World Bank, there's just been a steady increase in electrification. It's gone from around 45% to 55% of the country over this kind of 7 years. Whereas if you look at the IEA, you see there was kind of an increase, a rapid increase, and then it's stalled and then it's declined. And if you took those two data sources, the question is, what's your policy decision? If I go by the World Bank data, I'm going to think that my electrification strategy is a huge success, and I'm going to continue doing it. If I, by comparison, take the IEA data, then I'm going to think, hang on a minute, something's not working, and I need to reconfigure or reevaluate my planning processes. Perhaps I want to bring in those from the mini-grid sector, perhaps I want to adopt a slightly different strategy. And of course, this also affects financing decisions. So while we were interested in the kind of the macro data, what we were seeing across the continent as a whole, we were also really interested in understanding how different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa can actually measure are they using binary definitions, or are they using something a little bit more detailed, more concrete? So we did a kind of a rapid scoping view of policy documents of all 48 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's quite difficult because you can imagine countries like South Sudan, which are kind of conflict-ridden and have a kind of barely functioning government. The extent to which you can find those policy documents online can be challenging. So what we did was look at kind of these publicly available policy documents for Sub-Saharan Africa. We looked at 48, and essentially what we found was that basically these are the kind of definitions that we found of electricity access, the different ways in which the 48 countries are measuring it. And you can see that the majority either have no definition of electricity access, well, or a binary definition. And then some of them are simply measuring proximity to a transformer. If a community is within 200 meters of a transformer, they're considered to have access to electricity, whether or not they actually have meters in their homes. So that's another kind of 3 countries. Some get data from utilities and kind of track connections, and others actually measure usage. But you can see there's a huge diversity in what's being measured across the 48 countries. And what we then did from there was to do a pilot study, another pilot, where we looked at 4 countries to say, okay, well, this is giving us a fairly kind of crude idea of what the policies are measuring, but what are we actually seeing in 4 countries? So we looked at Kenya, we looked at Senegal, we looked at the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sierra Leone. And we did interviews, we did between 2 and 4 interviews in each of the country, and again looked at policy documents to see what we were finding. Basically, in these 3 countries, Senegal, DRC and Sierra Leone, again, there is no, it's basically, they're all using kind of binary measures. But what I think is particularly interesting, if you look at Kenya, these are all official documents from Kenya that you can find through Kenyan government. And you see we have different definitions even within kind of publicly available government documents. So percentage of households with access, percentage of people in the country have relatively simple and stable access, primary surveys on the sample across the 47 countries to establish using clean fuels for lighting, primary energy source for lighting. And you see what you get even within formal definitions is discrepancies within a country about what percentage is actually counted as having access to electricity, from as high as 92% to as low as 70%. I just think this is really interesting, and obviously we have a long way to go if we're going to look at all 48 countries, but it's something that we're hoping to be able to do. So I forgot to mention that I have spent quite a lot of time in Latin America. I love the continent. I think it's an incredible place to be in, and so much of my work is focused on biofuels, but also thinking about electricity access and energy provision. And I did a study back in 2020, 2017 to 2019, which was working in a part of Colombia called Chocó. Have any of you had the privilege of going to Chocó? Yes? Did you like it? Yes, yes. It's one of those kind of forgotten spaces of Colombia. Yeah, yeah, yeah. A place that tends to be neglected, I would say, compared to other parts of Colombia. So this, by comparison, is Medellin, and this is Chocó. This is Biosolano in Chocó, which is in the kind of northwest of the country. As our colleague says, it's a part of the country which is very forested. It rains. It's apparently the 2nd wettest place on the planet. but it's essentially got no roads to a lot of communities that live there. It's got a very high Afro-Colombian population and a lot of indigenous people who also live in Chocó. And I was working with the university there who were interested in seeing whether kind of different renewable energies at small scale, so solar and wind, would work for the communities who are essentially off-grid there. And while we were there, we had the opportunity to essentially to follow the utility as they provided these communities with access to electricity with grid connections, so connected to the kind of the meso-grid that was based in the kind of nearest city. So all of these houses had access to electricity, and you can see the kind of distribution lines going to each household. But one of the challenges they faced was because it's so wet, because it's so forested, at least once a month a tree would fall and take down the power lines, which meant that essentially many of these households were left without access to electricity. The other place where I have worked recently is Peru, and in Peru we were interested in the intersections between housing and energy, kind of two SDGs that are perhaps not always combined. And we were working in informal settlements, slums, favelas, to see, basically, to look at the kinds of electricity access that people had. And if you're interested, most of the work I've linked here if you're keen to have a look. But this, again, was an example of the different types of energy access that people are provided with. In many of these settlements, so this is very much on the outskirts of Lima, up in the hills that surround the city, which is where the city is expanding into. And one of the challenges that communities initially face is obviously getting access to land, which means that the state then provides them with services. And electricity wasn't the main issue for these communities, it was water and sanitation. But once they had access to electricity, you can see there was often the electricity provided was not legal, so it was kind of connected to neighbouring households. And you saw kind of quite unsafe, insecure, risky electricity provision, which caused kind of challenges for people living in the households, things like fires and so on. So it's clear that having access, if we're thinking about Colombia, for example, both of these settings have access to electricity, but there's a big difference between what these households are provided with and what these households are provided with. And so there is obviously recognition that simple definitions of have not are not enough. They're not sufficient to describe the very real differences in electricity between these two settings. And so the ESMAP, which is the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, has around 10 years ago developed something called the multi-tier framework, which recognises the different attributes of electricity access. And it recognises that it needs to be adequate, available when needed, needs to be reliable, it needs to be of sufficient quality, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be legal. And what I think is also interesting is that they're thinking not just about the household level, but they're also thinking about communities, so things like access to things like having community centres which have access to electricity, health centres, schools and so on, but also in the work domain. So thinking about things like irrigation, but also milling and telecommunications, which I think is really important, that we're not just focusing on the household, particularly when we're thinking about productive uses of energy. We need to be linking household consumption to other kind of domains of energy. And this essentially is the multi-tier framework. And you can see the different attributes of electricity. So reliability, things like 14 disruptions a week. So basically tier 1 is considered to have no access to electricity. Tier 5 is essentially grid access. The World Bank considers basically tier 2 to be having access to electricity, And then tier 3, 4, 5 are kind of what we should be aiming for. So you can see that there's just a much better breakdown of what it means to have access to electricity in different settings. You see things like health and safety, and kind of legality, so accidents due to electricity connections, again thinking about the informal settlements. People need to have safe provision, safe installation of electricity in their homes. And this has been tested. You can imagine there is a big difference between simply carrying out survey and saying, do you have access, do you have electricity in your home? And doing a survey that really tries to understand all of these different elements. But it's very revealing in terms of what you actually see in terms of the levels of electricity provision that people have. So the MTF has been tested in, I think, about 8 or 9 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia. And I understand, so it was done in Ethiopia, and a colleague of mine in Ethiopia said that one of these surveys took about an hour and a half to do with a household, which is a phenomenally long time if you're looking for representation in your data. And it also generates an awful lot of data, which not all statistics agencies have capacity to be able to analyse. But what I think it shows is just the difference between, so Zambia has an access rate of something like 43%, according to national statistics, but that falls to about 9 or 10% in rural areas. And you can see here, a huge majority of people just have no access to electricity in rural areas. Whereas in urban areas, you've actually got most people who are kind of grid connected. You're seeing tiers 5, 3, 4, and 5 here. So you're seeing a very different picture, a much more complicated and nuanced picture of electricity access in Zambia. I've been working quite a lot in Zambia recently, and what's also interesting, I think, they have like Brazil, the country is basically dependent on hydropower, on hydro energy for its power. But Southern Africa has faced a very severe drought, partly driven by climate change, which means that Zambia for the past kind of 18 months or so has largely been without electricity. It has maybe most households in urban areas have maybe 3 hours of electricity a day, and that tends to come on at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it's phenomenal to see people's capacity to adapt. So for the middle classes, much more adoption of solar home systems, but an awful lot of people simply not using electricity. So another piece of work that I've been doing, I mentioned that I've been very lucky to work in a multidisciplinary environment, so I work a lot with energy system modelers. And one of the things that we are interested in, their evidence, their work kind of feeds in directly and informs government. But all too often it kind of fails to capture some of these nuances and these differences, but also the needs of different populations, different types of people who use that, and the different needs that they have for energy. So we've been thinking about how to factor in gender equality and social inclusion into energy system models. And this is just an example of the types of energy needs that are faced by different social groups. So for children and young people, there's a lack of reliable electricity for studying after dark. You need energy for education. For rural communities, we see a lack of reliable energy infrastructure. There's dependence on traditional fuels, which has impacts on health, and then low and certain incomes leading to affordability challenges. And then what most of you will probably be familiar with is the kind of emphasis on women and girls, and particularly women's needs for electricity. And we see that there are gender differences between energy poverty. Women tend to face energy poverty more profoundly because they're the ones who are doing the cooking. They're often the ones who spend most time at home and in the community. They're affected by a lack of formal land and resource ownership. So some work we've been doing in Ghana has shown that increasing land use for utility scale solar has basically disempowered women who are kept out of decision making about the use of that land because they lack that formal ownership. And then obviously women are affected by those domestic and caregiving responsibilities. Again, you're not going to be able to read this, so my apologies. But what we are thinking about is taking that kind of diversity of needs and thinking, how can we feed that into quantitative models? Models that are essentially not designed to factor in many of these issues, but how can we bring them in? So we have basically developed a kind of framework for thinking through ways in which you can begin to factor in gender equality and social inclusion that doesn't necessarily involve kind of tweaking the model, but rather about the framing of the research questions. So thinking about the research design, can you prioritize specific GESI needs? Can you bring different groups in to shape your research questions, the questions you're asking of your models? Can you bring some of these social issues into your model implementation? So can you change some of your model inputs? Can you think about the data you're using? Then there's a question of the outputs and the interpretation. Who are we engaging with the outputs of our research, with the outputs of our models? Can we have a more GESI-sensitive approach to doing that, to thinking more explicitly about how we interpret the results of our models and thinking through some of the consequences for different social groups? And then finally thinking about the impact and communication of our models. And what we hope is through this framework that we can basically begin to get more kind of GESI-sensitive energy planning kind of evidence and models. This is an example of some of the work that we've been doing on disability. So a colleague of mine ran a workshop in Kenya with disabled people with different disabilities. And I think this is just a really nice kind of graphic recording of the conversations that they had about the way in which people with disabilities are affected by energy, and to come up with what they called a research and action agenda. So you can see some of the participants who attended the workshop, some reflections on the types of research that could be done. So having a focal point for people with disabilities in government ministries, develop and implement national transport access standards, and then some ways in which they can kind of do interventions in disability. I said that I was going to talk about demand, so I'll do that very quickly because I realise I'm also running out of time. But just one of the challenges that once you have provided access to electricity, one of the challenges is for many utilities, for the mini-grid providers, is that the demand simply doesn't materialise. The utilities in Sub-Saharan Africa are under a lot of pressure to extend the grid, but they are, most of them, I think something like 2 of the utilities in Sub-Saharan Africa are solvent, all the rest are on the verge of bankruptcy. So there's a real challenge in terms of developing new infrastructure, maintaining and extending the grid, and connecting new customers. I expect that we'll see increasing role of the private sector, or we are already seeing that, particularly in off-grid settings, but obviously they remain profit-driven. And as I've mentioned, the key challenge is that demand often fails to materialise, and you can see here the average per capita electricity consumption is much, much, much lower in Sub-Saharan Africa than it is in the US or Europe. And this is a graphic by a colleague of mine, Julia Tomei, which, not beautifully displayed, but basically it's kind of showing you this is the number. So this is a year of connection between 2009 and 2015 connection to the grid in Kenya. And this is the monthly customer consumption in kilowatt hours. And you can see that demand essentially for most of these groups either plateaus or it diminishes over time. And this is for rural consumers, where you see a kind of similar pattern, but obviously much lower levels of consumption. And then you see a similar pattern for urban customers. And I've seen similar figures to this for off-grid providers. So for solar home system providers, what they're seeing is an initial kind of increase in demand, and then it basically falls over time. And we simply don't understand why that's happening. And if you're going to have increased private sector involvement in the sector, if you're going to address issues of insolvency with the utilities, we need to think about demand. And for this, there's this kind of growing emphasis on productive uses of energy. So some colleagues and I did a series of knowledge briefs where we thought about demand and the strategies that other countries, China, Germany, Colombia, have used to kind of increase demand. We were talking earlier about tariffs, and that's an obvious one, particularly if you can reduce tariffs for low-income groups, you could increase demand there. Improved electricity service provision. A lot of people simply don't consume because the electricity isn't there or it's so unreliable. There's also a challenge of accessing appliances. Many of the people who receive provision access to electricity are on very low incomes. So financing solutions. Another example is thinking about targeted interventions for productive uses. So combining your connections with appliances, targeting a bank load customers, so restaurants, agri-processing facilities, and then you can use that to extend to kind of extend the grid or access to communities. So I promised that's the end of my presentation. I've got 2 more slides. I wanted to just reflect on what I think some issues. You know, we've seen the withdrawal of US aid. Lots of European development agencies have also reduced their development spend. And this is a graphic by an organisation that has basically been tracking the impact of the US aid cuts. And you can see essentially in green is those that are still going on, and in red you can see those that have been cut. You can see infrastructure has faced 100% cut from US aid. Others that have been affected that are relevant are agriculture, which is here. So you can see a kind of a huge cut in the amount of projects that have been funded by US aid. I think we can expect to see a growing role of China. I think you're already seeing that here in Brazil. That's definitely taking place across Sub-Saharan Africa. Increasing role for the Middle East, particularly in critical minerals. India, I think, also has aspirations or expectations to increase its influence. Brazil, I imagine, you know, particularly through the ethanol diplomacy, there are ways in which Brazil is also extending its reach. I think we also expect to see, in a context of diminished public sector spend, I think we can see a growing role for the private sector, for philanthropics and for private finance. And I think we'll see huge innovation, continued innovation in technologies, in business models, and in financing. And I think the key is going to be about increasing demand, and the argument will be about economic growth. And then I'd love to see us, when we think about what happens post SDGs, post 2030, I'd love to see kind of a reflection on the use of binary indicators. I think the problem is probably politics. It doesn't help Ghana that it has an 87% electrification rate because it's based on proximity. And if there's a revision to that, that's not good for the government. So, some conclusions. I think the binary measurements need revisiting. Could we be thinking about minimum use thresholds? What's the political appetite for changing? What do we do? How do we begin to track in reliability, affordability, and quality? The MTF is great, but it's time intensive and it creates a lot of data. What about the needs of different groups? And then I think importantly, we need to recognise that access to electricity isn't a single step, simply because you provide the access. It shouldn't stop there. We need to think about how we increase demand, how we support community uses, how we support productive uses of energy. So we need to go beyond the provision of the infrastructure alone. We need to think about these different domains and how this supports sustainable livelihoods. And then a plea for a kind of systems approach that energy is important, but energy matters because of what it enables, because of what it facilitates. So we need to be thinking about the connections between energy systems, agriculture, health, education, and transport, and so on. And that's me.
Thank you, Julia, for your presentation. Marcelo, I'd like to make some comments.
Okay. So, Professor Julia, I think, offers an in-depth discussion on the energy access debate in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, it's a hot topic. As we all know, this is a challenge for the poorest countries and regions on the planet, taking into account that we are talking about modern and clean energy. Yeah. Professor Julia gave a general picture that some things have improved, yeah, especially in terms of the access to electricity, but others have not access, for example, to clean cooking. Remember that smoke from cooking fires is a dramatic problem in many sub-Saharan African countries, responsible for million deaths of children, yeah, per year. Yeah, it is important to emphasize that the scale of poverty, lack of access to electricity, and the problem of smoke from cooking fire is greater, of course, in sub-Saharan African countries when compared to Latin American countries. Yeah, so there's a huge difference. Yeah, between these two groups of countries. Of course, in Latin America, we have serious problems, including Brazil. Yeah, but in general, our average income is higher. Yeah, significant higher than in sub-Saharan countries, and it facilitates the implementation of policies to mitigate these critical problems. Yeah. These African countries have the highest income inequality in the world. But Colombia and Brazil are also among the 10 worst. Yeah. Again, the problem among Africans is that they also have the lowest per capita incomes. And of course, this is very, very significant to the problem that we are discussing here. Another important issue which Professor Julia illustrated very, very well, especially for a continental country like Brazil, is it's a very regional inequalities. Yeah, because you have showed average numbers for countries. Yeah, but Brazil, as we know, we have a lot of regional difference. So in Brazil, where we know that poverty and the lack of electricity are more concentrated in north and northeast regions. Yeah. In other words, for sure, it is necessary to have a regional perspective approach. Yeah. But even considering the methodological limitation pointed for accounting access to electricity, looking, for example, just for the connections to the grid, it is important to mention the Light for All program in Brazil. In Portuguese, we say Luz para Todos. Almost 2 decades ago is not worthy. Yeah, just to remember some general aspects regarding to the program Light for All. It is a federal government initiative launched in 2003. So we have 22 years of experience in this program with primary goal of expanding access to electricity in rural and remote areas. Yeah. At that time, the target was to provide electricity to 10 million people. Yeah. The numbers changed a little bit. I'll talk about it. The program aimed as well to bring social and economic inclusion to millions of Brazilians who had long been excluded for a long, long time to the national electricity grid. So, at that time, as I said, approximately 10 million Brazilians, yeah, that was it was the target, particularly those living in isolated communities, such as indigenous villages, quilombolas. We say quilombolas as descendants of Afro-Brazilian slaves, and small farmers, mainly in the Amazonian region in Northeast Brazil. Yeah. Of course, the absence of electricity severely limited opportunities for education, healthcare, sanitation, communication, and economic development. Anyway, by 2022, that I made a very fast research yesterday. Yeah, in 2022, the program had reached over 17 million beneficiaries through more than 3.5 million new electricity connections. Okay, we are talking about connections, but it is, yeah, has its value. So, the program employed various technological solutions to adapt it to the unique characteristics of different regions. Yeah. In more accessible areas, traditional grid extensions were used. Yeah. But in contrast, in remote or environmentally sensitive locations, often received off-grid renewable energy systems. Yeah. Mainly solar panels and some cases small hydroelectric generators. Yeah. Well, these adaptations helped the program remain environmentally sustainable while ensuring energy access in hard to reach areas. Yeah. So connect to the sustainable development goal number 7. Well, despite its success, the program faced several challenges, including logistical issues in reaching the remote communities, high implementation costs, and delays in some states. However, it is widely regarded as one of the most successful social development initiatives in Brazil in recent history. Yeah, significantly reducing energy inequality. The number of, or consider the number to access of electricity in Brazil is 99.8%. Of course, we have, especially in Northeast region, yeah, we have some problems, of course, relate to the poor people. Yeah. So the program accumulated investments around $5 billion. Yeah. I'm talking about it because this initiative, of course, would be much more difficult to implement in countries, yeah, or in sub-Saharan countries that you will face, of course, challenges regarding to the financial resource, yeah, to finance a program like that. Yeah, it's important to say that when compare 17 million people, yeah, that were benefited by the program, remember that is around 8% of our population in Brazil. Yeah, it's a huge number. But so, returning to Professor Julia's presentation, the aspects raised in her research regarding the limitations of information and methodology, avoiding binary metrics to characterize access to electricity are absolutely fundamental when we want to have an appropriate view of the sustainable development goals. Yeah? And there is no doubt, we need to provide a multi-dimensional energy access, including, of course, gender equality and social inclusion. Yeah. In terms of research, when dealing with models, I'm talking to myself, that would support policymakers, it is important to conciliate a methodology or a framework that deals with macro and micro dimensions. I think that's the challenge for us. Yeah. Many times our tools are able to deal with macro dimension only. Yeah. Regarding demand, this brings me to the old question of which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Yeah. Well, if the answer is egg, in our studies looking to contribute to establish the conditions that lead to sustainable development, there is no way to escape an analysis that looks and the energy supply accompanied by a development project, paying attention to local conditions and including in its planning the intended changes in the local economic, social, political, institutional structure. Yeah, is quite difficult. This requires investment, a cost that present to be paid by agents with this capacity. But when well executed, it will bring benefits to everyone, of course, especially to the poorest. Yeah. I understand Professor Julia's research, of course, contributes to the need for a more in-depth view of general metrics that often hide the reality that we often don't want to see. Perhaps because it comforts us in thinking that we do that that we do is already sufficient, but of course it's not. For sure, it's necessary to go beyond. Yeah. So Professor Julia, thank you for your presentation and for teasing us. Okay.
Before just taking you the word, just to complement what Marcelo was talking to us, this program Light for All, Luz para Todos, was very successful in this over 20 years. But it's important to say that part of the part of the resource that financed these programs was provided by the other electricity consumers who pay for it in the tariff. Like it's a subsidy that part of this is in the tariff. So the government 2 days ago just announced the inclusion of 60,000 more people in this subsidized part of the population, subsidized part of the population that will receive some incentive and reduce tariffs to consume more electricity. So it's undoubtedly is a very important initiative to provide more electricity for a huge number of people, but we need to be aware with the how these subsidies are going to impact the other consumers. So we have a very expensive electricity tariff in Brazil with lots of other subsidies which are included beyond this one. So for the middle class payers, let's say it's a little bit heavier. So maybe the government should take care about this kind of things. So these are some of the things that we need to take care in the next steps. And one thing that I think that it's a problem here in Brazil, besides the inequality that Marcelo was talking about, is this multi-dimension energy access that you present to us. Because when the government says 90.99% of the population is connected to the grid, yes, it is. But if you take the other dimensions, like all of these people have reliable energy, not even in São Paulo. Sometimes we stay days without energy in cities as São Paulo. So imagine in remote places in Brazil. Good quality, not so much. Legal, so if you go to some communities in Rio de Janeiro, for example, we have a heavy problem with the illegal connections. And it's a huge problem that utilities have to deal with. And once more, the other electricity payers pay for these problems. So we have lots of different challenges also to universalize the electricity connections and access here in Brazil, but we have space to improve it. Like our country advanced a lot, and we can share our experience, but there are other great challenges that need to be addressed in the coming years. So I think it's a long path.
We have this social for electricity, yeah, to support, yeah, the poorest people. And regarding the reliability in electricity in the city of São Paulo, we don't have this problem in Piracicaba, okay?
Julia, to complementar, we can open questions for the audience.
I mean, Luz para Todos is one of those programs that everybody, I mean, it was a huge success. And I think it's one of those programs that countries in Sub-Saharan Africa could, might want to look to. The challenges, as you said, Marcelo, is finance. That many states in Sub-Saharan Africa simply don't have the financial resources to be able to pursue a large-scale kind of electrification program like this, for especially because so much of the population is rural, they're subsistence farmers, they'll tend to be very isolated, so actually extending the grid is going to be challenged. So that mix of solutions you talked about, I think, will be key. And I think, I mean, I put the MTF up again because I think it's a really nice way of just illustrating that, when we're thinking about access to electricity, there's an assumption that we're thinking about tier 5, and actually in an awful lot of cases we're thinking about tier 2. This is 3 watts power capacity, this is 4 hours of electricity a day. Is that good enough? I don't know. Anyway, I can just...
Yeah. Thank you. So, Dia, please.
Thank you, Julia, for your speech. I'm considering the Máximo Torero hands-in-hands approach related to FAO, that trying to map the different rural communities situation in different countries, mostly in Africa and Latin America. And then based on a multi-tier framework like yours, but you're focused only in energy. Máximo Torero's work is focused on different perspectives and included political situation. For example, the inner part of Nigeria, that you have a lot of conflicts, or the north of Ethiopia, that you also have different situations that impairs the possibility to develop some policies. I wonder if this kind of approach can result in some synthetic indicators that can be coupled with the Máximo Torero perspective, or just because I consider his proposal one of the best proposals related to rural development and reduce of poverty, and I consider that it fits better your approach, that the part of this access to energy is important, but it is not give some impact if you don't have the way to promote others means or policies for development.
One of the things I think is quite exciting in this space is data. I'm a qualitative social researcher. I should say I started off as a biologist, so I am quite interdisciplinary. My career spans 20 years, and I went from biology to ecology to kind of social sciences. But I'm really excited about data and the amount of geospatial data. So I think your idea of mapping the context and the needs of different communities is absolutely the way to go. With the MTF, they have, so this is at the household level for electricity. They also have a similar framework for cooking with different attributes. And then they also have it for productive uses and for community uses. I think the problem with it is it's too complicated. If you're going to be rolling this out across the world, I mean, there's an expediency issue with the binary. Do you have access to electricity? Yes, we've ticked a box. we've done that in our census and we can move on. Whereas this takes an hour and a half to do, and that's very difficult to do, even on a 10-year basis. And I think your point also about thinking, not just about energy, but beyond energy and the linkages, and that's why that mapping of communities, of their needs, of their resources is absolutely critical. And then the politics, as you say, lots of the countries that we're talking about in Sub-Saharan Africa face huge conflicts and also regional conflicts. And so the difficulties again of providing access to electricity, it's a complex space.
Thank you so much, everybody, just to participating. Julia, it was an amazing presentation with so important issues for all of us. Marcelo, thank you for your contribution, making the parallel with the Brazilian case and bringing the Brazilian experience to share with everybody. And to all of you who made questions and participated, thank you so much. And I think we are done, right? That we can cut there.